everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
About time that we get to a point where a single source, a single repository of not just data, but knowledge on how to use that data is available to accelerate transparency, accelerate usage of this data. So that's at an agency government level. Now let's talk commercial. The honest truth on the commercial side is we're all still positioning to figure out how best to commercialize at scale all this data. We, as we discussed, have our own platform, Spectra, that we are using to deliver data and to give people a chance through a freemium model to access and scale up on the utilization of the data. We fully realize that in order to scale up the use of the data, we want to work with other platforms. But it's at the point now where those other platforms are just testing and trying to understand which customers will pay what for what kind of data and under what licensing terms. So I'm eager for that collaboration on the commercial level to accelerate. And I think it will happen in the next 2 to 3 years, particularly as some of the financial regulations coming into place. And with all the regulations we talked about were more on the emissions regulations than industrial regulations. But there's a whole other layer of financial regulations and financial reporting, climate risk, which I think will drive more of that business collaboration you're talking about.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. So today I'm joined by Stéphane Germain, President and CEO of GHGSat. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Scott. Pleasure to be here.
All right. So, well, first of all, congratulations on making it onto the Time Magazine's Time 100 climate list last year. I wonder if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was very honored to be named to the Time 100 climate list. For me, it frankly was a bit of a surprise. We have been, working for years as a team to build GHGSat and to have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions using our satellites and working with our customers. And I was really honored to be identified and named. So it's the honor was followed by an event and a dinner in Dubai during COP28, and I was even more humbled to see the company I was in when I went to that dinner. So really, it's fantastic for me personally, but certainly for the company to be recognized in this way.
That's amazing. Again, congratulations. Now,
Thank you.
A little bit about your company. If you could tell us how your organization is providing satellite and remote sensing capabilities to specifically measure greenhouse gas concentrations from industrial facilities around the world.
Right. So what we do is we invented a sensor and a system that allows us from space to monitor emissions from individual facilities on the ground. So the sensors are designed to measure things like methane emissions from oil wells, from landfills, from coal mine vents, pretty much any industrial sized source of methane, and now also carbon dioxide. We've recently launched our first carbon dioxide sensor. So I can get into some of the science of that, but really the idea here is to help companies and governments understand the total emissions from their facilities and then use that information to ultimately control and reduce their emissions.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about your customer base? Who are they and how are they using your data and analytics for what purpose?
So we have three different kinds of customers. The first is the industrial operators themselves. And so that can be an oil and gas company, an oil and gas major. It can be also industrial operators of coal mines, for example, so large coal mining operators. It can be large waste management companies that operate landfills. So those operators really want to understand where their emissions are, how big they are, and how that differs, if at all, from the estimates they've been using to date. Because most of those companies have been using estimates for what their emissions are. We're going in and directly measuring. So that's one type of customer. If I group them together, that's industrial customers. The second type is government. So here we have quite a range. We have everything from government scientific agencies like NASA, for example, that's public, is working with our data and evaluating our data for use in scientific analyses of emissions and the ultimate link to climate change. But we also work with other groups that want to analyze patterns and changes of emissions for climate negotiations. So we really have quite a wide range of government customers for that purpose, or those purposes. And then the third type of customer is, I guess you could call them everything else, but the main one within that group is financial services. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons why different financial institutions are interested that range from insurance to asset management to risk management. So each of those is interested in specific measurements at sites or everything up to aggregated total emissions to understand patterns and changes.
Let's go back to oil and gas a little bit. So one of the issues, of course, with oil and gas is going to be the flaring and the venting from these operations that represents some 500 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. Can you talk to us about how your data helps them to get you mentioned the estimate versus the kind of the reality, right?
Yep.
And how does that inform decision making then helps them to address some of the flaring and the venting and some of the retrofit that needs to happen?
All right, so flaring and venting is a great subset of oil and gas. And so one of my customers put it to me really succinctly one day, and it's always stuck with me. He said, look, you're helping me find my big leaks fast. It's that simple. So they may have tens of thousands of facilities in the US alone, hundreds of thousands of facilities or leak points in their infrastructure around the world. And satellites are uniquely capable of looking at that huge array of facilities or leak points and being able to spot, there it is, and that one's big. You need to jump on that one fast, probably ahead of like this pinhole leak in this valve in another place. So we help them by detecting it and then measuring the direct magnitude of that emission so that they can then action it. They can send a team to go fix the ones that are the most problematic. So that's one clear way in which we can help operate. But just to get back to estimates versus measurement, another way we help is that there may be some types of facilities that you just use what are called engineering factors. You'll say, this type of facility operating at this level of capacity with these kind of processes will, using this table of numbers, emit X per year. We'll come along and go measure it. And we'll say, actually, it's emitting Y. And then we can dig into what the differences are between the two. And that can be really important. And we've helped one operator, for example, in the US realize that their as-built configuration for this particular piece of equipment was different than what was in the plans. And that's because there was a construction mistake. And as a result, they were venting methane at 10 times a higher rate than they should have been. And they didn't know until we pointed it out to them, because methane can't be seen. It's transparent. It can't be smelled in nature either. So unless you're specifically going out to measure it, you're not going to know the difference. So that's another example of how we can help customers.
So this brings up a really great point, which is the fact that there needs to be an improvement in the independent measurement, reporting, and verification technologies, because to your point, a lot of the self-reported emissions by oil and gas or coal or any large industrial complexes is going to be oftentimes much lower than the independently measured emissions for exactly some of the examples that you mentioned. And interestingly enough, the largest self-reported sources of emissions are then different from the largest independently measured sources. So we clearly have a set of discrepancy kind of across a spectrum. What are the ways that we should be addressing this systematically across the globe?
So you hit the nail on the head. not only is the total magnitude of emissions different, and there's been several studies over the last few years that have shown, just if we look at the US and Canada, that it can be off by a factor of 1.5 or 2. So the real as measured emissions can be 1.5 to 2 times higher than the as reported or estimated emissions. Not only is the magnitude different, but the distribution is different. So what you thought was your biggest emitter actually may not be your biggest type of emitter. It might be another type of emission. So there might be a huge program put in place to replace a bunch of valves, which are important. You definitely need to replace those valves from type A to type B to reduce your emissions. But it may turn out that your intermittent venting from unbalanced operations because they've grown too quickly is much more important as measured than what's going on with those valves. So it allows companies to use their capital more efficiently. It allows them to understand the real ROI of their investments based on real measurements as opposed to estimates. So we know that our work with customers leads to reductions in emissions, first and foremost by helping them find their big leaks fast, like I was talking about earlier. But also we know that working with them to systematically understand where their real emissions are will have a longer term reduction in emissions and a greater and longer term reduction in emissions than if we keep working on estimates. So it's been a fascinating journey so far, and we're really just at the start of it. In the US, there's been a tremendous amount of work done, but the emissions in the rest of the world are far larger. If we could apply the lessons learned in the US to Central Asia, for example, there can be enormous reductions in emissions overall.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Let's talk a little bit about some of the technologies in terms of the sensors that's used to detect methane emissions, and then being able to actually individually, identify those sources. You guys are using a number of different sensor capabilities, including the use of interferometer to observe these emissions. Can you talk about the current capability that's been launched, I think, as of last November, and some of the new satellites and new sensor capabilities we're looking to incorporate?
Okay, so first of all, just to put things in context, there's technologies on the ground, on drones, on aircraft, and in space. And so there's just a wide variety of different types of sensors. There's active sensors, so ones where you use a light source to send out a signal and receive a signal back. There's passive sensors, ones that use reflected light from the sun, for example. And so there's just a wide variety. We have chosen to use what's called a passive infrared sensor, or the technical term is a wide-angle Fabry-Perot interferometer. And that was specifically designed to address the need of a facility-level emissions detection from space, and to do that in as small a satellite as possible. So there's a bunch of constraints there, but scientists and engineers love that. Here's the problem: it's really hard. Go fix that. So we started with the market need, and then we invented the technology to do it. So the way it works is, general terms, is we use the light reflected from the surface of the Earth, so light from the sun reflected from the surface of the Earth, and our sensor then measures the amount of light absorbed by the gases present in the atmosphere over that site that we're monitoring, due to the presence of methane or carbon dioxide. So a spectrometer, and an interferometer is another type of spectrometer, is essentially looking for that. It's looking for the absorption lines in the spectrum that are the telltale signals of the presence of the gas in the atmosphere above the site. And then the depth of the absorption lines, or how much light is absorbed, is proportional to the amount of gas that's there. So you can then determine not only is the gas there, but how much is there. And you can do that at a very high resolution. We've designed our system so that we have millions of pixels in our picture, just like you'd have millions of pixels in an iPhone camera picture. But each one of our pixels is collecting concentration information. So it turns out that each of our pixels on the ground is about 25 meters by 25 meters. So in every 25-meter pixel, we have a concentration measurement, and that allows us to then determine what the emission rate, where there are emissions, and what the emissions rates are from those sources. So that's a quick thumbnail sketch. There are other sensors, there are other technologies. In space, right now, they're all variations of what I just told you, of spectrometers or interferometers. They're more exquisite ones that are, you know, on order of, you know, up to $500 million to build, that are typically built by national agencies. And then there's smaller ones like ours, purpose-built ones, miniaturized ones that can be carried on small satellites like ours that are not designed to do everything the big space agency ones are designed to do, but can still do a very good job for the task that we've asked them to do.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point that you bring up in terms of the ability to miniaturize and work within a CubeSat context, as an example.
Yes.
Now, the thing with methane is it's a bit tricky, right? Because the plumes or the diffuse methane represents about 80% of methane emissions. And yet, most of the satellites, even the ones that are sophisticated, much larger, really have a difficult time detecting some of these plumes. Now, we know, of course, of methane SAT that's been funded by the Environmental Defense Fund, that's looking to launch a satellite that's going to be able to, be able to measure these plumes like it wasn't, hasn't been done before. Talk to us about it's one thing to identify the key source of concentration, but it's another to identify the remaining 80%. And I wonder where you guys stand in terms of the ability to do that.
Right. So really glad you brought up MethaneSat. So MethaneSat is a fantastic initiative by the Environmental Defense Fund, and it's actually complementary to what we do. So let me explain that. In the world of satellites, although we all kind of use the same technology, we operate in different ways. So there are some satellites that are designed to see the whole world every day. And to do that, they have to cover a lot. So each of their pixels on the ground, their resolution is coarse, and each of the pixels on the ground is like kilometer scale pixels. You can't identify individual sources, but you can see the whole atmosphere every day. That's really for scientific purposes. At the other extreme, there's satellites like ours that are designed with really high resolution pixels, like 25 meters on the ground, so that we can identify the sources and relate those to specific owners. So we know that oil well, that gas well, that compressor station at these GPS coordinates, which is owned by that company. In between the two, you have MethaneSat. What MethaneSat wanted to do, and is going to do, is look at an entire basin. So 400 kilometers by 400 kilometers, like the whole of West Texas and southeastern New Mexico. And they're going to say, what are all the emissions in that area in aggregate? Has that totality of emissions gone up or down? And track that over time. And they'll be able to see some really large sources as well. But the way we work together, the reason we're complementary is because they're going to say, look, within that large area, there's this hotspot over here that I'm not entirely sure what's going on. And we're going to say, aha, we can go tell you. So we're going to task our satellites based on what we were told by MethaneSat, and we'll go identify at high resolution what's going on. That's called tip and queuing. And so they'll tip us as to where there's a hotspot and queue us in time as to when we should go look or when it happened. And that will allow us together to get a better picture of what's going on. And we've already been doing that. We've been doing that for 4 years with a European satellite called Tropomi. And that satellite is one of those global mappers I was talking about that looks at the whole world every day. And because each one of their pixels is like 5 by 7 kilometers on the ground, they can't tell. They know there's something going on there, but they don't know what it is. So they tell us to go look, and we find out within that pixel what it is that's leaking. Is it an emission? Is it an oil well? Is it a landfill? What is it? So we confirm it and demonstrate with high resolution what it is. So that's how we work with different satellites in a complementary way. And frankly, every satellite that's out there today is complementary. And every satellite that's going to come out in the near future, I would argue, is still complementary because we need the capacity from all of them. So it's a big, long-winded answer, but I hope it gives you a bit of a better picture of what's going on with different satellites out there today.
And I think that brings up a good point around, I think it's your product or an aggregation. It's called Spectra that takes some of these images from a GHG satellite, but also other satellites, and be able to actually assemble this kind of high resolution methane map of some of the concentrations around the world.
That's
Is
right.
that kind of what you're getting at? And then that is it's available to the public. And how is that available? I think it's even free to some extent.
Yeah. So we realized a few years ago that we needed an efficient way to distribute all this data to customers. So we built this web-based platform called Spectra to distribute our data to our customers so they could go on a map and click and say, oh, this is this facility that's leaking. And if they get in the morning and they'll see an alert telling them, you got a new facility emitting over here, they know where to go and they can dispatch their teams. Then they can work with APIs, insert that into the workflows. And that's what Spectra was designed for. Then we realized, actually, we can turn that into a SaaS platform. We can turn that into something that people can sign in, get a view of what's going on in an overall region, and then slowly ask for permissions to get more information, more in depth on specific areas or specific operations. So that is now a platform that we use. Yes, we even offer it for free. We use it with customers, but we also offer a basic version for free so people can go kick the tires and see, what is this data all about? What does it look like? How could I use it? And then they can upgrade themselves to operational use after they've gotten used to it and they see the value in it.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach in terms of a freemium model. And really, sometimes it's a lot easier for them to interact with the data and the analytics directly to see the value, rather than
Exactly.
trying to sell that every single time. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And of course, anything more
And
sophisticated, you guys can develop custom reports, I would imagine.
yeah, and exactly. So what we've done now is not only do we have our data on there, but we take third-party satellite data because there are some public satellites with sensitivity to methane. We also layer that on. And so we have layers that we can allow people to subscribe to that are not just our data, but third-party data, and then analytics combining that data together.
Yeah. So let's add another layer. You guys have introduced the ability to detect carbon dioxide
Yes.
into your new satellite. Talk to us about that again. It's a completely different, chemical compound, and so some of the spectrometer and metaspectra aspects are going to be different. So talk to us about that and how that gets layered into these analytics for companies to consume.
So we wanted from the beginning, and thus our company name, to look at the key greenhouse gases and provide services for measuring those greenhouse gases from space. And so GHGSat, greenhouse gas satellite, and so it was meant to be both methane and carbon dioxide. On our first satellite, we actually were able to do both. But because we tried to do both with the same instrument, we did it not so well. So one of the lessons was, let's get one thing right. And so we tuned our next instrument to be methane. And there's been such a demand for methane data that we focused our next 12 satellites, actually next 16 satellites, all on methane. But finally, we decided it was time, and there's enough of an expected market demand for carbon dioxide that we dedicate one to carbon dioxide, and we launched it in November of 2023. So we're very excited to have that satellite up. We expect to be sharing results from it shortly. And really what it's addressing is other market segments that are different than methane. So yes, it's a different gas, but the technical approach to measuring it is almost identical. It's the same instrument. It's just tuned to different spectral lines. And for us, it's a very minor change. And then it allows us to open up a whole new set of markets for emitters of carbon dioxide, which are heavy industry like steel, aluminum, cement, power generation, thermal power generation. So these are different kinds of operators. But we expect the same patterns we saw in methane, which is that the measured emissions are different than the estimated emissions, and the distribution of emissions to perhaps be different than what people thought. We expect to see the same thing in carbon dioxide.
So let's talk about regulation and policy. So in Europe, there's a bit of a carrot and a stick approach where companies are being held accountable to not only their goals, ESG goals, but also to effectively be penalized if they don't meet those goals in the form of different tariffs and taxation schemes. In the US, I don't think we're quite there yet. So tell us about, there's some things where companies of those different industries and verticals are willing to do on their own, but without the heavy hand of regulation and penalties, let's say, they're not going to necessarily take the next step. So again, this all has implications to your customers and customer acquisition. So what's the selling points in the US that perhaps is different in the Europe, EU, or perhaps maybe that's different in emerging markets like Central and Southeast Asia, for instance?
So regulation in greenhouse gases is actually a fascinating and complicated subject. There are just a wide range of tools that governments have decided to experiment with and ultimately implement. So as you said, there's kind of a carrot and stick in Europe. There's a carbon tax in Canada. There's a cap and trade scheme in Canada. There is a new methane fee coming in place in the US. There's outright regulations that require you to be below certain emissions thresholds in virtually all those jurisdictions. And and one more, there's a carbon border adjustment mechanism that's being implemented in Europe that other jurisdictions are starting to look at as well. If the Europeans are going to do it, maybe we should do it too. So all of those actually make for a pretty dynamic environment if you're a large oil and gas operator to evaluate with operations in each of these jurisdictions, how do we respond to it? And so some of the largest operators have realized years ago that it is in their interest, first for operational efficiency, and then for reputational reasons, and then for compliance to regulations, that they need to get on with it and measure and reduce their emissions. So it's a combination of all those factors I just mentioned. It's not just the fact that there's a heavy constraint that's about to be imposed on them. It's the fact that they operate in multiple jurisdictions. It doesn't make sense for them to tune one operation versus another when they can just apply the program globally and help improve their operational efficiency by leaking less and reduce their costs in some cases by being more efficient in the way that they capture and distribute what is at the end of the day a sellable commodity in the form of natural gas. So there's lots of motivations, of course, depending on the jurisdiction of the operator. If you're an operator in Asia versus an operator in the Middle East versus an operator in North America or South America, you'll have different pressures. But there's been a clear trend towards each of these operators now realizing they needed to get on with measurement anyway.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Now, you mentioned previously partnerships with organizations like NASA, ESA, as well as the International Methane Emissions Observatory. But I want to bring up the context of something like a Bloomberg data. So it's one thing to have a platform, but when you're also the data provider, could you not hook in with other ESG or sustainability platforms that are becoming very much required and necessary, especially in places like EU, like we mentioned? So how are you guys becoming more integrated into these other larger platforms where you guys are the source of the data and you're charging for that data?
So let's start with the NASAs and the Europeans for a minute, and then we'll get on to the more commercial platforms. So we absolutely collaborate with major agencies in the world on technology development, technology validation, standards, so that we have interchange of data that's more user-friendly for all users, not just scientists. And so that collaboration, and then the central repositories of data that those different organizations are setting up are hugely important. And I'll give a little shout out in the US to the US Greenhouse Gas Center. That's a new initiative that's been set up, a multi-agency setup that's just been announced at COP28. To me, it's about time that we get to a point where a single source, a single repository of not just data, but knowledge on how to use that data is available to accelerate transparency, accelerate usage of this data. So that's at an agency government level. Now let's talk commercial. The honest truth on the commercial side is we're all still positioning to figure out how best to commercialize at scale all this data. We, as we discussed, have our own platform, Spectra, that we are using to deliver data and to give people a chance through a freemium model to access and scale up on the utilization of the data. We fully realize that in order to scale up the use of the data, we want to work with other platforms. But it's at the point now where those other platforms are just testing and trying to understand which customers will pay what for what kind of data and under what licensing terms. So I'm eager for that collaboration on the commercial level to accelerate. And I think it will happen in the next 2 to 3 years, particularly as some of the financial regulations start coming into place. And with all the regulations we talked about were more on the emissions regulations than industrial regulations. But there's a whole other layer of financial regulations and financial reporting, climate risk, which I think will drive more of that business collaboration you're talking about.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And that on that note, I have been joined by Stéphane Germain, President and CEO of GHGSat. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.